I always thought betrayal would feel loud, like shouting or breaking glass. But when I caught my fiancé with someone else, it was silent, like the air had been pulled out of the room and I was the only one who noticed. His jacket was still on the chair I bought him, his watch ticking on the nightstand, and he looked at me like I was the one who had walked in uninvited, like I didn't belong in my own life anymore. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there in my heels, still holding the stupid white dress I was supposed to wear in 3 days, and something inside me shifted so quietly, it almost felt like nothing had happened at all. I turned around before he could explain, before he could lie, before I could break, and I walked out into the cold night air of Manhattan, the city humming like it always did, like nothing had changed, even though everything had. I kept walking past the valet, past the line of black cars, past the life I thought I had built, until I reached the curb and realized I had nowhere to go. Not really, because home was no longer a place. It was just a mistake I had been living in. That's when I heard the door of a car open behind me. Not loud, not urgent, just intentional. Emily Carter. A voice said, low, controlled, like it didn't need to be raised to be heard. I turned, slowly, because something in my chest told me this moment mattered more than the one I had just left behind. The man standing beside the black SUV didn't look surprised to see me, didn't look curious. He looked certain, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Tailored suit, dark hair, eyes that didn't wander, didn't soften, didn't ask for permission. I didn't know his name yet, but I knew what he was. You don't grow up in this city without learning how to recognize power when it decides to show itself. You look like someone who just lost everything, he said, and there was no sympathy in it, just observation, like he was stating a fact he had already verified. I let out a small laugh, sharp and unfamiliar, because he wasn't wrong, but he also didn't understand. Not yet. No, I said, adjusting my grip on the dress, feeling the fabric wrinkle under my fingers. I didn't lose anything. I just realized it was never mine. His gaze sharpened at that, like I had said something worth remembering. And for a second, the noise of the city faded, the traffic, the voices, the distant sirens, all of it blurred into the background until it was just me and him and the space between us. Good, he said finally, stepping closer, not enough to invade, just enough to change the air. Because I need a wife, not a victim. I blinked once, processing the words, expecting a joke, a smile, something to make it make sense, but there was nothing, just that same steady gaze, like he had already made a decision and I was the only variable left. Any sane person would have walked away, would have called a cab, would have chosen safety over whatever this was, but I wasn't sane anymore. Not after tonight, not after watching my future fall apart in a room that still smelled like my perfume. I tilted my head slightly, studying him the way he was studying me, and for the first time since I walked in on that scene, I felt something other than emptiness, something sharp, something alive. And what do I get out of it? I asked, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. His lips moved, not quite a smile, more like the idea of one, controlled, measured, dangerous. Whatever you want, he said. And then, after a pause that felt deliberate, as long as you understand, once you step into my world, you don't walk out of it. I looked back at the hotel for half a second, just enough to see the reflection of who I used to be in the glass doors, the girl with a plan, with a future, with a man who said he loved her. Then I looked at him again, at the man who didn't promise love, didn't offer comfort, only truth wrapped in something darker. I want to ruin him, I said quietly, feeling the words settle into place like they had been waiting for me all along. His eyes held mine, unblinking, unflinching, and for the first time that night, I felt seen, not as something broken, but as something useful. Then get in the car, Emily, he said. Opening the door for me like this was the most normal thing in the world. Like marrying a stranger at midnight was just another transaction. I hesitated for exactly 1 second, long enough to understand that whatever I was about to do would change everything. Then I stepped forward, because some choices don't feel like choices at all. They feel like consequences. And as the door closed behind me and the city lights blurred through the tinted windows, I realized something I hadn't expected. I hadn't just walked away from my old life. I had walked straight into someone else's, and this time, I wasn't the one in control. I did not ask where we were going. And he did not offer an explanation, the kind of silence that feels deliberate, like a test you do not realize you are taking until it is already too late to change your answer. The car moved smoothly through the city, past streets I had known my entire life. But somehow they looked different through the dark glass, distant, quieter, like I had already been separated from them. I kept my eyes forward, my hands folded in my lap, still holding the dress I had never worn. The fabric now creased and meaningless, just another thing that did not belong to me anymore. Lorenzo De Luca, he said after a while, not looking at me, his gaze fixed ahead as if the road required less attention than I did. You should know the name of the man you are about to marry. I let out a slow breath, repeating it once in my mind. The kind of name that carried weight even if you had never heard it before. The kind of name people lowered their voices around. You always proposed to strangers in the street? I asked, my tone light, but my pulse steady, because fear had burned out somewhere between the hotel and this car. Only the ones who do not flinch, he replied, and that almost made me smile, because he was wrong about one thing. I had flinched, just not in front of him. The car turned into a private drive I did not recognize, the city noise fading behind iron gates that opened without question, like they already knew who he was, like everything did. The building ahead was not a house, not. Really, it was something colder, sharper. All glass and steel and silence. The kind of place that did not ask for permission to exist. When the car stopped, he stepped out first, not rushing, not waiting, just moving with the quiet certainty of someone who had never been told no. And for a second I stayed inside, watching him through the window, wondering if this was the moment I was supposed to change my mind. It passed. I opened the door and followed him inside. The air was cooler, controlled, every detail intentional, from the polished floors to the absence of anything unnecessary, like comfort had been removed on purpose. A woman approached us, efficient, composed, her eyes flicking to me only once before returning to him. Everything is prepared, she said, her voice calm. Like this was routine, like bringing a stranger home to marry her before midnight was just another item on a schedule. Good, he said, then finally looked at me, really looked, as if measuring something he had not decided on yet. You have 1 hour. I frowned slightly. 1 hour for what? To decide if you understand what this is, he said, stepping closer, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the shift in the air again, that quiet pressure he carried without effort. This is not a game, Emily, not a performance, not something you walk away from when it becomes inconvenient. I met his gaze without stepping back, because if this was a test, I was already too far in to fail it now. I told you what I want, I said, my voice even. I want to ruin him. His eyes held mine for a long second, searching, calculating, and then something in his expression settled, like a decision had been made. And I will give you that, he said quietly. But you need to understand something first. A pause, deliberate, controlled. Revenge does not feel the way you think it will. I tilted my head slightly, considering that, because part of me already knew he was right. But it did not matter, not yet. Neither does betrayal. I replied, and for the first time, something almost human crossed his face, not softness, not warmth, just recognition. He stepped back then, creating space again, like he had taken what he needed from the moment. 1 hour, he repeated, turning away as if the conversation was already over, as if my answer had been given long before I spoke. I watched him walk away, the sound of his footsteps fading into the quiet of the house. And for the first time since I got into that car, I allowed myself to feel it, the weight of what I was about to do, the fact that I was standing in a place I did not belong, about to bind myself to a man I did not know, all for the sake of destroying someone who had already proven he was not worth the cost. I looked down at the dress in my hands, then at the reflection staring back at me from the glass wall across the room, and I barely recognized her, not because she was broken, but because she was choosing this. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet voice whispered something I was not ready to answer yet. What if this was not about him anymore? What if this was about me? And what I was willing to become to prove I was not the one who lost. I did not spend the hour thinking about him. I spent it thinking about myself, about the version of me that would walk out that door and the one who would stay, because only one of them would survive this night. The room they gave me was too perfect, too quiet, like it had never been lived in, just prepared, like everything in his world, and I stood in front of the mirror for a long time, not fixing my hair, not adjusting my clothes, just staring, waiting for doubt to show up, waiting for fear to make a convincing argument. It did not. What I saw instead was clarity, sharp and uncomfortable, the kind that does not ask if you are ready, only if you are willing. I placed the white dress on the bed, smoothing it out slowly, almost carefully, like I was saying goodbye to something that had already been gone for a while. Then I stepped back and let my hands fall to my sides. You are not doing this for love, I whispered to my reflection, just to hear it out loud, just to make sure there was no illusion left. You are doing this because you chose it. The words settled in the room like a promise, or maybe a warning. When the door opened behind me, I did not turn immediately. I already knew it was him. The space shifted in that subtle way it always did when he entered, like everything adjusted around him without being told. Time is up, Lorenzo said, his voice calm, unaffected, as if he had not doubted my answer for even a second. I met his eyes in the mirror before turning, holding his gaze as I faced him fully, because if this was the moment that defined everything after, I was not going to look away. I am not afraid of you, I said, not as a challenge, not as defiance, just as fact. Something in his expression changed, not softer, not warmer, just more focused, like I had confirmed something he had already suspected. That makes you dangerous, he replied, stepping closer, the distance between us narrowing with intention rather than impulse. I crossed my arms slightly, grounding myself in the moment. Or it makes me honest. A pause stretched between us, quiet but heavy, like a negotiation happening without words. Do you understand what this marriage is? He asked, his voice lower now, more deliberate, like each word had been chosen before it was spoken. I nodded once. A contract, a strategy, a way for you to get what you want, and for me to get what I need. His eyes searched mine for a second longer than before, as if testing the weight of that answer. Then he gave a small nod, not approval, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement. And once it begins, he continued, there are no revisions, no exits, no second thoughts. I let out a slow breath, feeling the finality of it settle into my chest. Not heavy, just real. Then we should not waste time pretending there are. For the first time, the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough to recognize the shape of one. Good, he said, then turned slightly toward the door. Come with me. The hallway outside was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels intentional, like sound itself had been reduced to what was necessary, and I followed him without hesitation, my steps matching his pace, steady, controlled. We stopped in front of a set of double doors, taller than anything else in the house, and for a brief second, I felt it, the weight of what stood on the other side. Not fear, not regret, just awareness. Lorenzo reached for the handle, then paused, glancing at me once more, not questioning, not warning, just giving me the space to reconsider if I needed it. I did not take it. Open it, I said quietly, because some doors are not meant to be approached slowly. They are meant to be crossed completely or not at all. He held my gaze for half a second, then pushed the doors open, revealing a room lit in soft gold. A few people already waiting. Everything prepared with the kind of precision that made it clear this had never been uncertain. I stepped forward before I could think about it, before I could measure the cost again, because I had already paid it the moment I chose to stay. And as I crossed the threshold, I understood something I had not before. This was not just the beginning of a marriage, it was the end of who I used to be, and there would be no going back. The room did not feel like a place where people made promises. It felt like a place where decisions became permanent. The soft golden light reflected off polished surfaces, everything arranged with precision. A long table, a few witnesses, a man standing at the center who looked more like a judge than anything else. And for a brief second, I wondered how many lives had quietly shifted in this exact space without the outside world ever noticing. I slowed my steps as I approached, not out of hesitation, but awareness, because every movement here seemed to matter more than it should. Lorenzo walked beside me, not ahead, not behind, exactly at my side. Like this was not something he was pulling me into, but something we were stepping into together, even if we both knew the truth was more complicated than that. Emily Carter, the man at the center said, his voice calm, neutral. like he had done this 1,000 times and none of them had ever surprised him. Do you understand the nature of this agreement? The word agreement hung in the air longer than it should have, replacing everything softer that people usually used in moments like this, and I nodded once, because anything more would have sounded like doubt. Yes, I said, my voice steady, even to my own ears. I do. He turned slightly toward Lorenzo. And you, Lorenzo De Luca? Lorenzo did not hesitate, did not look at me, did not soften the moment with anything unnecessary. I do. It was strange how simple it sounded, how something that would change everything could be reduced to 2 words spoken without emotion, without ceremony, without illusion. The man gave a small nod, then gestured for us to step closer, and I placed my hand in Lorenzo's when instructed, the contact firm, controlled, not warm, not cold, just deliberate. His grip did not tighten, did not reassure. It simply held, like he was anchoring something rather than comforting it. This union, the man continued, is recognized under the terms you have both agreed to, binding in all respects, without exception. I focused on his voice, on the structure of the words, because if I thought about what they meant, even for a second, it would become too real, too immediate. Do you, Emily Carter, accept the terms as they have been presented? I felt Lorenzo's gaze on me then, not pressing, not forcing, just present, like he was waiting for the exact moment I crossed the line. I inhaled slowly, letting the air settle before I spoke. I do. There it was, clear, final, irreversible. Do you, Lorenzo De Luca, accept the same? I do, he repeated, just as steady, just as certain. The man nodded once more, then reached for the document on the table, sliding it toward us with a pen placed carefully beside it. Then formalize it. I stepped forward first, because hesitation did not belong here, because I had already chosen this long before I walked into the room, and I signed my name with a hand that did not shake, each letter deliberate, controlled, like I was rewriting something rather than ending it. When I stepped back, Lorenzo moved forward without a word, his signature. Quick, precise, final, like it had always been inevitable. The man reviewed the page briefly, then set it aside. It is done. Just like that. No music, no applause, no moment to breathe between who I was and who I had become. Lorenzo turned to me then, fully, his eyes locking onto mine with a focus that felt different now, sharper, more defined, like something had shifted the moment the ink touched the page. He reached out, not abruptly, not gently, just intentionally, his fingers brushing against mine before closing around my hand again. And this time it felt different, not because of pressure, but because of meaning. You made your choice, he said quietly, low enough that only I could hear it, his voice carrying that same controlled weight it always did. But now there was something underneath it, something I could not quite name yet. I held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to let the moment belong only to him. So did you. A pause stretched between us, silent but charged, like the first move in a game neither of us intended to lose. Then he gave a slight nod, almost approving, almost acknowledging, and released my hand just enough to guide me toward the door. As we walked out of the room, the air outside felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just changed, like the world had adjusted to something it could not undo. And as the doors closed behind us without a sound, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else that night. This was not the moment I married him. This was the moment I gave up the illusion that I was still in control. The hallway felt longer on the way out, or maybe I was just more aware of every step now, of the sound of my heels against the floor, of the way people moved just slightly out of Lorenzo's path without being told, like his presence carried its own instructions. I walked beside him, not behind, not ahead, matching his pace because anything else would have felt like a mistake. And for the first time since this started, I understood something clearly. This was not just his world, it was a system, and I had just agreed to become part of it. You are quiet, he said after a few seconds, his voice low, almost casual, but nothing about him ever truly was. I glanced at him briefly, then forward again. I am thinking. About regret? He asked, and there was no judgment in it, just observation, like he was collecting data rather than testing me. I let out a small breath, considering the question honestly, because anything less would be pointless now, No, I said. About consequences. That seemed to interest him more. I could feel the shift in his attention even without looking. And what have you concluded? I stopped walking for a second, just enough to make him pause as well, then turned to face him fully. Because this answer deserved more than a passing glance, that I am willing to live. With them, silence settled between us. Not uncomfortable, just measured, like something important had just been placed on the table. His eyes held mine for a moment longer than usual, searching, weighing. Then he gave a slight nod, not approval, not surprise, just acknowledgement, like I had confirmed a theory he had already formed. Good, he said simply, then continued walking, expecting me to follow, which I did without hesitation. We stepped into a different part of the house, quieter, more private, the kind of space that felt removed from everything else, like decisions were made here that did not need witnesses. He stopped in front of a large window overlooking the city, the skyline stretching out in front of us, lights flickering like something alive, something distant, something that no longer belonged to me the way it used to. Tomorrow, he said, his reflection steady in the glass beside mine. Everything changes. I crossed my arms lightly, grounding myself again. Already has. His gaze shifted slightly, meeting mine through the reflection, and for a second, there was something almost curious in it, like he was trying to understand where that certainty came from. Your former life, he continued. Your fiancé, your job, your apartment, it will all be handled. The way he said handled made it clear this was not a discussion, not something I needed to worry about, just something that would happen. I tilted my head slightly, studying him now, because this was the part that mattered. And what does that mean exactly? He turned then, facing me directly, closing the distance by a step that felt intentional, controlled. It means, he said, his voice even, that you will not need to look back. I held his gaze, not breaking, not softening. What if I want to? That earned a pause, a real one this time. Like the question had not been part of his expectations. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. You do not, he said after a moment. Not as an order, but as a conclusion. I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was honest. Brutally so, and honesty was the only thing that still made sense right now. You do not know me well enough to decide that. I replied quietly. Something shifted again, subtle but real, like I had pushed against a boundary he was not used to being questioned. He studied me for a long second, then exhaled slowly, not frustrated, just recalibrating. You are right, he said, and that surprised me more than anything else he had said tonight. But you will learn that looking back is rarely as useful as you think. I let that settle, not agreeing, not arguing, just storing it away. Because something told me he was not speaking from theory. The room fell quiet again, the city lights reflecting around us, and for a moment, neither of us moved, like the night itself was holding its breath. Then he stepped back slightly, creating space again, that careful balance he maintained between control and distance. Get some rest, he said, his tone returning to neutral, composed. Tomorrow, we begin. I watched him turn and walk away, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the hallway, and I stayed where I was for a few seconds longer, staring at the reflection in the glass, at the version of me that looked the same but felt completely different. And as I stood there in the quiet, one thought settled into place with unsettling clarity. I had asked for revenge, but I had just entered a world where revenge was not the end of the story, it was only the beginning. Morning did not arrive gently. It arrived with precision, like everything else in this house. The curtains opening on their own to let in the sharp New York light. The city already awake, already moving, as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. I stood there for a moment, barefoot on cold floors, watching the skyline stretch endlessly beyond the glass, and for a second, I almost forgot where I was, almost forgot what I had done, until the weight of the ring on my finger pulled me back into reality, subtle but undeniable. It was not large, not overly extravagant, just exact, like it had been chosen with intention rather than emotion. I turned my hand slightly, watching how the light caught it, how something so small could redefine everything. A soft knock broke the silence before I could think too far ahead, and the door opened without waiting for permission. The The same woman from last night stepping inside with quiet efficiency. "Good morning, Mrs. DeLuca," she said, her tone calm, respectful, like the name had always belonged to me. I did not react immediately, the title settling into the room before it settled into me. And when I finally turned to face her, I gave a small nod, acknowledging it without fully accepting it yet. "Mr. DeLuca is waiting for you downstairs," she continued, placing a neatly arranged outfit on the bed, everything coordinated, everything chosen, like even my appearance had already been decided. I glanced at it briefly, then back at her. Does he always plan this far ahead? She allowed herself the smallest pause, like the question had an answer she chose not to fully share. "Mr. DeLuca does not leave things to chance." That was not surprising, not anymore. I dressed without argument, not because I agreed, but because I understood. Something now, control in this world was not taken in loud ways. It was built into every detail until you stopped noticing it. When I stepped out into the hallway, everything was already in motion, quiet footsteps, distant voices, the house functioning like a system that did not require attention, and I followed the path instinctively, down the stairs, toward the part of the house that felt less like a residence and more like a command center. Lorenzo was exactly where I expected him to be, standing near the long table, reviewing something on a tablet, his posture unchanged, his presence as steady as it had been the night before. He did not look up immediately when I entered, but I knew he was aware of me, the same way he was aware of everything. "You are on time," he said after a moment, his voice even. Like punctuality was not appreciated, it was expected. I walked closer, stopping across from him, keeping just enough distance to remind both of us that I was not here to be positioned. "I was told you were waiting." His eyes lifted then, meeting mine directly, measuring, always measuring. "I do not wait," he corrected calmly. "I prepare." I let that sit for a second, then nodded slightly. Because that, at least, felt honest. He set the tablet down, shifting his attention fully now. "Today, we begin correcting your previous situation." The way he said it made it sound clinical, detached, like my life had become a problem to be solved rather than something to feel. "Correcting," I repeated, my tone neutral but deliberate. "That is one way to describe it." He studied my reaction briefly, then continued without adjusting his approach. "Your former fiancé has already been contacted." That stopped me, not visibly, not enough for him to call it out, but enough for something inside me to tighten slightly. "And?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, refusing to let curiosity turn into vulnerability. Lorenzo stepped closer by a fraction, not enough to close the space completely, just enough to shift the balance again. "He is confused," he said, choosing the word carefully, which is expected. I exhaled slowly, picturing it for just a second, the disruption, the uncertainty, the first crack in the version of control I had seen him pretend to have. "Good," I said quietly, not smiling, not reacting beyond that single word. Lorenzo's gaze did not leave mine, not missing the absence of satisfaction, the lack of visible triumph, and something about that seemed to register. "You expected to feel different," he observed. I held his gaze, not denying it, not confirming it either, just letting the truth exist between us without needing to define it. "I expected it to matter more," I said finally, and that was the first time something shifted in him in a way that felt real, not strategic, not controlled, just a brief flicker of understanding. He did not respond immediately, and in that silence, I realized something I had not considered before. This was not just about destroying someone else's life. It was about discovering what was left of mine after I tried. And as Lorenzo straightened slightly, his expression returning to its usual composure, he said something that settled deeper than anything else that morning. "Then we will make sure it does." The silence after his words did not feel empty. It felt intentional, like he had just placed something in front of me and was waiting to see what I would do with it. I held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, then looked away first, not because I was backing down, but because I was thinking, and thinking in his world felt like a risk I was still learning how to take. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice steady but quieter now, because something about this conversation had shifted from strategy to something else, something less defined. Lorenzo did not answer immediately, which was becoming a pattern, not hesitation, but calculation. like every word he gave me was measured for impact rather than accuracy. "It means," he said finally, stepping around the table slowly, not circling me, but moving in a way that made space feel different. "You are expecting an outcome that depends on him, when it should depend on you." I frowned slightly, turning to face him fully again. "I am not expecting anything from him anymore." "That is not entirely true," he replied, his tone calm but precise. "You expected his betrayal to break you. It did not. So now you expect his downfall to fix something. It will not." The words landed harder than I expected, not because they were cruel, but because they were accurate in a way I had not wanted to admit. I crossed my arms instinctively, grounding myself again. "Then what exactly are we doing?" He stopped a few feet away, his eyes locking onto mine with that same steady focus. "We are removing variables," he said simply, "so that what remains is real." I let out a slow breath, processing that, because it sounded less like revenge and more like something I had not agreed to, something deeper, something I was not sure I wanted. "And what if I do not like? What remains?" I asked quietly. For the first time, he did not answer with certainty. There was a pause, brief but real, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more measured than before. "Then you will have the truth, and that is more valuable than comfort." I held his gaze, searching for something in his expression, something human, something that told me this was not just another controlled response. And for a second, I saw it. Not softness, but something close to experience, like he was not speaking from theory, but from memory. Before I could respond, a phone buzzed on the table between us, sharp in the quiet, and Lorenzo glanced down briefly before picking it up, his expression shifting back into something more familiar, more contained. He listened for a few seconds, said nothing, then ended the call with a single movement, placing the phone back down with quiet finality. "It is beginning," he said, not looking at me this time. Something in the way he said it made my chest tighten. Slightly. Not fear, not anticipation, just awareness. "What is?" I asked. He turned his head just enough for his voice to carry clearly. "The consequences you asked for." I did not move, did not speak, because part of me understood that whatever was happening now was already in motion, already beyond my control, and reacting too quickly would only expose something I was not ready to show. Lorenzo stepped closer then, not invading, not dominating, just closing the space enough to make the moment feel more immediate. "You can watch it unfold," he said, his tone neutral again. "Or you can walk away and pretend it does not exist." I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was impossible. There was no version of this where I walked away unaffected. "I did not come this far to look away," I replied, meeting his gaze again, steady, unflinching. Something in his expression shifted again, subtle but real, like I had confirmed something he had already decided, and he gave a slight nod. "Good." He stepped back then, creating distance once more, returning to that balance he maintained so carefully. "Then come with me." I followed without hesitation, because whatever this was, whatever he had set in motion, I needed to see it. Not for him, not even for revenge anymore, but for myself. As we moved through the house, the atmosphere felt different, quieter, heavier, like something unseen had already begun to ripple outward. And as we reached the next room, where screens lit up the walls and information moved in silent patterns, I realized something with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. This was not just about ruining someone who had hurt me. This was about stepping into a world where consequences were not emotional. They were calculated, and I had just agreed to become part of the calculation. The room felt colder than the rest of the house, not in temperature, but in purpose. Walls lined with screens, each one alive with movement, numbers, messages, faces, fragments of lives reduced to patterns that could be tracked and predicted. I slowed my steps as I entered, not out of fear, but because something in me needed to understand what I was looking at before I reacted to it. Lorenzo walked ahead this time, not far, just enough to signal that this was his space, his domain, and everything inside it answered to him. "This is where clarity happens," he said, his voice cutting through the low hum of technology, calm, controlled, like nothing here surprised him anymore. I moved closer to one of the screens, my eyes scanning the information without fully processing it yet, until something familiar caught my attention, a name, a location, a timeline that I recognized too easily. My breath did not catch. My body did not react. But something inside me focused. That is him, I said quietly, not asking, not doubting, just confirming. Lorenzo stepped beside me, his presence steady, unshaken. Yes, the screen shifted slightly, data reorganizing in real time, movements tracked, calls logged, patterns mapped out with a precision that made everything feel smaller, more predictable than it had any right to be. You have been watching him, I said, my tone neutral but sharper now. I observe everything that becomes relevant, he replied, and there was no apology in it, no hesitation, just truth. I crossed my arms, grounding myself again, because this was the part one had not fully considered, not just the outcome, but the process, the way it unfolded, calculated, controlled, detached, and now. I asked, keeping my voice steady, because whatever came next, I needed to hear it without reacting first. Lorenzo did not answer immediately, instead reaching out to adjust something on the screen, his movements precise, efficient, and as he did, new information appeared, messages, financial shifts, subtle disruptions that did not look dramatic, but felt intentional. Now, he said finally, we introduce pressure. I stared at the screen, watching the changes unfold, not dramatic, not explosive, just enough to destabilize, to create uncertainty where there had been confidence, to shift the ground without anyone noticing it move. This is not destruction, I said after a moment, my voice quieter now, more thoughtful than before. No, Lorenzo agreed, his eyes on the data, not on me. Destruction is inefficient. I turned to look at him fully, studying his profile, the calm in his expression, the complete absence of doubt. Then what is it? He met my gaze then, steady, unflinching. It is correction. The words settled into the room, heavier than it should have been, because it was not about revenge anymore, not in the way I had imagined it. It was something else, something colder, something more precise. I looked back at the screen, at the life I used to be part of, now reduced to a sequence of moves being anticipated and redirected, and for the first time, I felt it. Not guilt, not regret, but a question forming quietly beneath everything else. When does it stop? I asked, not looking at him this time. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, and when he answered, his voice was lower, more deliberate. When it is no longer necessary. I nodded slowly, because that was the kind of answer I should have expected, one that did not offer comfort. Only continuation. The screen updated again. Another shift, another adjustment, and I watched it happen without flinching, without stepping back, because this was what I had asked for, even if it did not look the way I had imagined. Lorenzo stepped slightly closer, not enough to touch, just enough to be present in the moment. You can still walk away from this part, he said, his tone neutral, almost offering. You have already made your statement. I let out a small breath, my eyes still on the screen, because walking away now would not change anything. It would only leave me with questions I would never answer. No, I said quietly, firm, certain. I need to see it through. He studied me for a second, not questioning, just confirming, then gave a slight nod. Then do not look for satisfaction, he said, his voice calm but precise. Look for understanding. I finally turned to face him again, holding his gaze without hesitation, because something about that mattered more than anything else he had said so far. And what happens when I understand? I asked. There was a brief pause, just long enough to feel intentional, and then he answered, that depends on what you are willing to become. The words lingered longer than they should have, echoing somewhere deeper than the rest, and as I turned back to the screen, watching the quiet unraveling of a life I used to be part of, I realized something with a clarity that was impossible to ignore. This was no longer about him at all. This was about me, and the version of myself I was choosing to step into, one decision at a time. Understanding did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces, small shifts that felt almost invisible until they stacked into something undeniable. And as I stood there watching the screens continue their quiet work, I realized I was no longer reacting to what I saw. I was anticipating it. The patterns were not random. They were intentional, guided, shaped, and somewhere between the first update and now, I had stopped seeing it as his world and started seeing the structure beneath it. You are already adjusting. Lorenzo said, his voice low, almost thoughtful, as if he had been observing me the same way he observed everything else. I did not look at him right away, my eyes still on the data, on the subtle shifts that no longer felt distant. I am learning, I replied, because that felt more accurate, less final. There is a difference, he said, stepping closer, his presence no longer unfamiliar, just constant. Adjusting is instinct, learning is choice. I turned then, meeting his gaze fully, holding it without hesitation, because something about that distinction mattered more than it should have. And which one do you think I am doing? He studied me for a moment, longer than usual, like the answer was not as obvious as he expected. Then he gave a slight nod. Both. I let that settle, because it felt true in a way that did not require agreement. And for the first time since this began, I felt something shift inside me, not resistance, not defiance, just clarity. I looked back at the screen one last time, at the life I used to measure myself against, now reduced to something predictable, something manageable, and I realized it no longer held the same weight it had before. It is not about him anymore, I said quietly, not asking, not doubting, just stating what had already changed. No, Lorenzo confirmed, his tone steady. It never really was. I exhaled slowly, the truth of that settling deeper than anything else had, because it meant everything I had done, everything I had chosen, had not been driven by him, but by something in me I was only beginning to understand. I stepped away from the screen then, creating distance on purpose, not because I needed to escape it, but because I no longer needed to stand that close to see it clearly. Lorenzo watched me, not stopping me, not redirecting, just observing, like he was waiting to see what I would do next without interference. You said this ends when it is no longer necessary, I said, turning back to him, my voice calm, grounded. I think I understand what that means now. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. Explain. I held his gaze, steady, unshaken, because this was the moment that mattered more than anything that had come before it. It ends when I decide it does, not when he is finished, not when the outcome is complete, but when I no longer need it to define anything about me. Silence followed, not empty, but full, like something important had just been placed between us. Lorenzo did not respond immediately. And for the first time, I saw something different in his expression, not calculation, not control, but something quieter, something closer to recognition. That is not how most people see it, he said finally, his voice lower, more measured than before. I am not most people, I replied, not as a challenge, not as defiance, just as fact. Another pause, brief but real, and then he nodded once, slowly, like he was acknowledging something he had not expected but could not deny. No, he said, quietly, you are not. The room seemed to shift around us, not physically, but in presence, like the balance had adjusted in a way neither of us had planned. I felt it too, not as power, not as control, but as something more subtle, something earned rather than taken. I stepped past him then, not waiting for direction, not asking for permission, moving toward the door with a certainty that felt different from before, less reactive, more deliberate. Where are you going? He asked, not stopping. Me, just asking. I paused briefly, glancing back at him over my shoulder, the city light reflecting behind me, sharp and clear. Forward, I said simply, because anything else would have been a step back. I did not wait for a response, did not need one. And as I walked out of the room, leaving the screens, the patterns, the version of the story that had brought me here, I understood something with a clarity that made everything else fall into place. I did not marry him to destroy someone else's life. I married him to rebuild my own. And somewhere along the way, I had stopped being the person who needed revenge and started becoming the person who decided what came next.